In this Path of Exile 2 video, I'm going to be talking about my hands-on impressions with the early access version of this game. I have played I don't know how many hours at this point over the last 10 to 11 days. It's an absolutely phenomenal ARPG, arguably the best around. I'm going to go into what I like and what I don't like in this video. But first, I want to get into the whole snafu that happened regarding our early video and just talk a little bit about that before we get into the actual impressions themselves. If you don't want to listen to this, you just want to skip straight to the review itself, you can use the timestamp on the screen or in the comments in order to get there quickly. So addressing the elephant in the room and the sort of snafu with the YouTube video and the wiki, essentially what happened was on November 26th, we were given access to Path of Exile by Grinding Gear Games, and also provided content guidelines for the sort of content that we could create with that access. This content included review impressions for this version of the game and guides up to and including Act 2. I was a bit surprised by their email, so I quickly replied asking for clarification about whether we could publish review and guides starting today being November 26th when we received the email, and they promptly replied with, yes, that is correct. It took me several days to get through the campaign before I did our impressions video that went up on November 30th, and it was only up for a few hours before Grinding Gear Games quickly realized that there had been a mistake, and they notified us asking us to take the video down. Which of course we did, and not long after that they made a post on the Path of Exile 2 Twitter account acknowledging that there had been a mistake on their end, and that's basically what had happened. Unfortunately, due to what I would consider some confusing language, some people latched onto the wording of that tweet and insinuated that even though we had permission to do a review, we didn't have permission to make guide-style content or edit the wiki. This, of course, led to toxic people in the gaming industry coming and vandalizing our wiki, leaving racist comments, telling us to kill ourselves, sending us death threats, and all the things that the toxic individuals in specific gaming communities do. And I want to be crystal clear here so there's absolutely no confusion. The content guidelines that we received from Grinding Gear Games for the version of the game that we have been playing over the last 10 to 11 days specifically stated that we are allowed to make guides for Acts 1 and 2 of the game, but not Act 3. I have since double-checked to make sure these content guidelines are indeed accurate, which I have been assured that they are, and I have also reached out to other content creators and colleagues in the space that are playing Path of Exile 2 on this build, and they do have the same content guidelines as me. We never published anything on the wiki from Act 3 during this time, and reviews have separate content guidelines that allows them to use footage from any part of the game. What this means is that today not only will you see reviews from specific content creators and press outlets coming out, but you will also see guide content created from this version of the game during the same period of time that we play. However, I would strongly caution you from following any guides that are published today, tomorrow, or maybe the day after, simply because the game was patched so many times during this period that we've been playing over the last 10 to 11 days that I don't think most of them will be currently accurate because a lot of things have changed. For this reason, you won't see any guides on our channel that are not made from the live version of the game in an attempt to make them as accurate as possible. So I hope all of this has given you guys some clarity about what happened, but that's enough about that. Today should be about Path of Exile 2 and celebrating this amazing game. I have so many good things to say about this game, so let's get on to our impressions. So the best way I can describe Path of Exile 2, and I know a lot of people are going to hate me for saying this because this comparison is overused, is it feels like the Dark Souls of ARPGs. And I know you don't want to hear that. A lot of people out there are going to immediately be like, oh god, why is he making this comparison? But it genuinely feels that way. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who was also playing Path of Exile Early Access, and we both thought the exact same thing. He's like, you know, this is going to sound weird, but this game feels a lot like Dark Souls to me, and you wouldn't think of it looking at it, but that is the exact same thought I had when playing, and I'll try and explain exactly what made me think that. Firstly, Path of Exile 2 begins with no difficulty option, meaning you can't just control the difficulty of the campaign from the get-go, and you're going to be playing on a challenging difficulty by default. Like, the normal version of this game is still very difficult, and it's not an easy game by any means. It's definitely going to challenge a lot of people, particularly that people that, like myself, that are not as familiar with Path of Exile or haven't played hundreds and hundreds of hours of the first game. It's going to challenge you when you play. You have to have a completely different mentality than you play something like Diablo, where you're not really expected to face any challenge until you get to the end game. You're going to face that challenge immediately in Path of Exile 2. And one of the things about this game, too, is that there are lots and lots of boss fights in this game, and the boss fights are very difficult in some cases. And you're going to die on those bosses repeatedly. I died many, many times on some of the bosses in PoE 2. I had to change up my build a few times, go farm some gear. grind up a couple levels to get through some of the bosses. It wasn't just like, oh, if I, beeline to the end of the game, I'll get there. I had to like take detours, level up, make my character stronger to get through the challenges of the game. And when you think of ARPGs in general, that's not something that you typically think about. You typically think of, I'll just face roll the campaign and then get to endgame, and that's where the challenge really is, as I mentioned earlier, but that's not the case here. And let me tell you, it feels so rewarding when you down some of these bosses after 5, 6 tries, 10 tries, something like that, where you really have to go in there and play well in order to beat the boss. It's not just some overpower build, particularly when you have a brand new character and you don't have like a horde of loot in your vault that you can just go pull out and make them super OP. But it's going to challenge you, and it's going to feel so rewarding when you finally down those bosses. And the best thing I can say, or the best comparison I can make here, is it gave me that same Dark Souls feeling, that Elden Ring feeling when I completed those bosses, that it just felt really rewarding to do so. There is a second difficulty in this game called Cruel that you will unlock after you defeat the game or complete the campaign, the first 3 acts of the game. It will basically unlock 3 new acts to play through that look like they kind of rearrange the order of the game a little bit, but it seems like similar areas with like maybe souped up enemies and things like that. But once you complete that, my understanding is that you'll unlock the end game for PoE, so then you'll be able to get into that. Secondly, enemies respawn on the map when you die now, and this absolutely makes the game feel more like Dark Souls. I know it's just a simple mechanic, but sometimes when you like run into a pack of enemies in a certain area, you'll get killed, or maybe you get one shot by a mechanic you didn't see and you'll die. And it definitely makes death feel more meaningful in the game. Like, you can't just like AFK, and if you die, ooh, big deal, you respawn and then run back to where you are. You like have to pay attention to what you're doing, and it adds a certain amount of tension as you're making your way through the game. And at the moment, this is a bit of a double-edged sword. I think it's for 2 reasons. First of all, the maps in some cases are absolutely astronomically large. We're talking like 1 to 1.5 hours to get from one side of the map to the other if you fight your way through and explore everything. They're quite large. And if you die a couple times and you have to run that a few times, it can still take you like 10, 15 minutes or 20 minutes to get, to the end again. And then if you get close and die and have to do that again, it can be somewhat frustrating. And secondly, it feels like the maps as a whole, even though their structure is there and there are some events in them, feel like they're missing a lot of those random events that happen. And I expect more and more of these to be added as the early access develops. But at the moment, they feel a little bit empty. So when you are running all the way through and die, and running all the way through and die, and running all the way through, but you're not seeing that too many interesting things happening, it can also lead to a little bit of repetitiveness. And this is something that I expect to get ironed out, through the development of the game. And the next thing to mention is that a lot of the mechanics of the game are not explained well, or they're not explained at all. And you really have to figure these things out as you go. And while that might seem like a negative when you hear that, it's actually one of the things I really like about Path of Exile 2, because even after getting all the way through, I can tell you that I just feel like I just scratched the tiniest surface of this game. Like, I feel like there's so much more to discover about it, particularly when it comes to mechanics and builds and, lore. Like, I didn't spend a ton of time looking through that, but I imagine that will get more and more interesting as I play. But I feel like I just barely touched what this game is after one playthrough. And if you're someone that loves to tinker with builds and play styles, and you can see the synergies between things and kind of theory craft, PoE 2 feels like it's like 3 games wrapped into one with the amount of things that you can do in terms of build variety. I think I'm not exaggerating when I say that. It feels like there's almost limitless combinations of builds in this game, and if you're a build enthusiast like I am, I think you're going to continue to discover combinations months and months after this game comes out, if not years. And it's something that's absolutely fascinating, and it's probably the biggest draw for me of this game, and I know it is a huge draw for a lot of longtime players as well. And one major change that I really love that they've done to the game is they've made it now so it's a lot easier to respec your skill points in the passive skill tree. There's simply an NPC that does this for amount of gold. The amount of gold seems to increase the higher level that you are. So you can really mess around with your skill tree a lot more. And, through my playthrough, I removed points and put points probably like a good 50 to 100 times, just experimenting with different combinations. And this really allows you to kind of go wild. Like, you can't just do it 1,000 times because you have that gold limitation there. But it does allow you the freedom to experiment and try different things, even in your passive skill tree. And I know maybe some hardcore players out there won't like this change, but I think it's such a good change to bring just a tiny bit more accessibility to players that like that mentality and don't want to feel like they have to start over or follow religiously some guide online, and that they can experiment and play around with it on their own. So I think that's a massive, massive win here. And another thing that I really enjoy too is that the skill gems in the game are not as randomized. Now you have uncut skill gems that you can convert into sort of the gems that you want for your build, which allows you to make progress in your build more consistently. It's still somewhat randomized, right? Like these are still random drops from enemies and bosses, and you don't get them all the time. But when you do get them, it's always great to see them because you know your build will get stronger from them because you can turn them into what you need instead of getting random skill gems that maybe have nothing to do with the build that you want. Now you're going to be able to basically always use these whenever you see them, and that's just a great, great addition in my opinion. I absolutely love the theme of the game, the dark theme of it, the art direction, absolutely outstanding in my opinion. And I love the way the game looks, and the details on skill effects and boss designs are frankly the best in the industry in this genre. It makes all the difference. When you're looking at them, you're just blown away by the amount of detail. Like you can see things moving on the bosses, like effects happening on the screen. They just look really good. And it really adds to the immersion of the game. You can see that the style of the game was clearly inspired by games like Diablo 2, with light emanating from the player and dark spaces around them. There's even a light attribute. Really, really enjoy this. And it's kind of a throwback, but also like a progression of that at the same time. Absolutely, hands down, the best I've seen for this genre so far. I will say, though, that I don't love the map designs completely. I kind of mentioned this a minute ago, but a lot of the maps are really large with a lot of kind of similar elements in them. And like as you're exploring, you might see the same thing again and again. Particularly Act 2 felt very samey to me. It's probably because of the biome is like a desert. But I do kind of wish that, in my mind, that the maps were a bit smaller, maybe like 2/3 the size. And maybe there was a few more maps instead to just kind of make the variety a bit more. As it stands now, a lot of the maps look very similar, and so there isn't quite as much variety as I would like. Mechanically, though, the combat in Path of Exile 2 is the most dynamic I've ever played in an ARPG of this type. The amount of environmental interaction and control you have over your character is, frankly, I don't think I've ever seen it done before in an ARPG to this degree, or this type of ARPG. You have so much direct control over your character's movements and actions that it almost feels like it's blending, you know, like the typical Dark Souls ARPG with a typical, you know, hack and slash ARPG. It's sort of somehow merged them into one genre that's its like own thing, which is incredible. And it's interesting because at first I really struggled with Path of Exile 2's controls, like because now when you move, you continue to move. If you're like click to move, you kind of continue to move in that direction, and it took me some getting used to. I was playing Ranger, so part of that is probably that. But then I found that like a lot of the boss arenas are not particularly large, so I would like over move a lot and get hit by attacks that I wasn't like trying to move that far, and I died a lot because of that. So for a little bit there, I didn't feel like I had a lot of control with my character, and it, you know, was kind of frustrating. But when I switched to controller, it was like a revelation. Everything changed for me. I felt like I was playing a completely different game. And frankly, it feels like this might be the first ARPG of this type, the hack and slash ARPG that's ever made, that was designed specifically for controller in mind first and mouse and keyboard second. And I know a lot of people might not want to hear that, and of course I could be wrong, that might not be the case, but that's just what it feels like to me. When you start dodge rolling, and you're strafing, and you're jump attacking, detonating, and it's all very fluid on a controller, very easy to do. It's so seamless to use your skills with your buttons and position your character correctly. They really, really nailed this aspect. And frankly, after I got, you know, used to the controller, after I was able to map all my skills and kind of set it up how I wanted, my potions on buttons, I don't think I'll ever play this game again on mouse and keyboard. It's just so good on controller that I can't help but think it was designed for that. Maybe some other people are, you know, very savvy with mouse and keyboard out there that might be able to run circles around me on the controller. But again, as somebody who's not like a hardcore player in this game, just plays really, really well on controller. And if you're somebody who really wanted to play a game like this on controller, or you like the way like Diablo 4 plays, you'll love the way this plays on controller, because I think it's even more dynamic than Diablo 4 so far. And something else that I really love that I want to mention is that Path of Exile 2 has couch co-op on one system, even if you're playing on PC. So you can play together on the couch, or, you know, in front of a computer with a friend or a loved one. They don't have to have the game. And this is something that Diablo's been doing successfully since Diablo 3. Both Diablo 3 and Diablo 4 have this. It's such a great feature and great option. I miss couch co-op in games. Really glad to see that PoE 2 has this. So those things being said, Path of Exile 2 is not a flawless game yet, and I emphasize yet because it's very beginning of early access. But it's not hard to see where this title is going. The writing is on the wall. It has the potential to dethrone Diablo 2 as the all-time king of the genre, and my guess is that it will likely surpass it. There are still issues with the game. Obviously, it's early access, namely bugs, missing content, crashes, stuff like that. Controller, even though the controls are really good, sometimes the menu hangs for 10 seconds when you're using controller, which doesn't happen on mouse and keyboard. Interacting with some things in the environment is not as easy. The combat is great, but there are other little caveats there that make it a little bit more difficult. But again, I want to emphasize that this is an early access. These things are expected to happen. I'm not, drawing attention to these to say, oh, I'm just simply saying that it's going to take some time to iron these out. That's what early access is for. But even with these things, you can see where this game is headed. Grinding Gear Games and Chris Wilson are the best in the business at what they do, and I strongly believe that they'll join the annals of greatness alongside the likes of Larian and From Software after the release of this game. They have an extremely good reputation and track record as the gaming industry as a whole, but much like Larian with Divinity Original Sin, they weren't quite as well known until they made Divinity Original Sin 2, and I think the same thing is going to happen here with Path of Exile 2. This game is going to explode. They're going to get the recognition that they undoubtedly deserve, and they're going to be up there with best game developers in the industry as a shining example of the types of games that are possible when you have a great team and a great leadership. So that wraps up our video about Path of Exile 2. I will try and get some impressions out of the end game as soon as I get there and get through it a bit to try and describe what it is and what I like about it, what I don't like about it, so you can look for that in the future. And I'll also have some class guides out there to kind of give you a general idea of how to play specific classes in the near future as well. Well, I want to hear from you guys. What do you make of Path of Exile 2 out there? Do you think my statements are overblown, that this could potentially be a Diablo 2 dethroner in terms of quality and going the distance over a long period of time? Am I insane for thinking that, or have you guys suspected this as well? Let me know in the comments below.